welcome. Thank you for attending this press conference. My name is Tyson Miller. I'm the Executive Director of Earth Insight, and we are a research and mapping organization. Today we are launching a report along with our partners, Leave It in the Ground Initiative and the World Commission on Protected Areas, and where this report analyzes threats, fossil fuel expansion threats to protected areas around the world. We'll also be joined by leaders from the Amazon Basin and Congo Basin regions. After I set up the research findings, then we'll hear from each of our speakers. Dr. Madhu Rao is chair of the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas. Kel Kuhn is executive director of the Leave It in the Ground Initiative. Fanny Kuru Castro, on the end, is the general coordinator of COICA, the Pan-Amazonian Indigenous Federation, and Blaise Mudodosi is coordinator of APEM, a civil society organization based in the DRC. So, as we all know, we are releasing this report at COP28 because we know that in order to meet 1.5 degree climate imperative, fossil fuel expansion must not be happening anywhere, yet it is happening everywhere. And the last places it should be happening is protected areas. They are symbolic of what's at stake and the need for much bolder action in addressing the climate crisis. If we take a look at protected areas in the mega-diverse, biodiverse tropical forest basins and the broader basins themselves, it is clear that we must chart a different path. If you want to advance the next slide there. In the Congo Basin region, and we're, maybe just hit the arrow there perhaps. In the Congo Basin region, nearly 129,000 square kilometers, or 12 million hectares, of protected areas are overlapped with oil and gas blocks. This is impacting 45 different individual protected areas and represents about 38% of their total extent in the region. And beyond the protected areas, which are highlighted in red, there are massive threats to the broader ecosystem and primary forests and communities that live within them. Virunga National Park, as an example, is Africa's oldest national park and most biodiverse, and 85% of the area overlaps with oil and gas concessions. Murchison Falls, also in Uganda, is also facing extreme dangers from oil and gas expansion due to the EACOP pipeline, with drill pads set to impact the Upper Nile and the waters of Lake Albert. Next slide, please. In the Amazon Basin, most of the, that's a slide that shows you Murchison Falls and the drill pads going into the above and set to impact the Upper Nile. In the Amazon Basin, most of the overlap with protected areas is in the western Amazon. You can hit the next slide. And we'll be focusing on, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Colombia basically have 98% of the protected areas that overlap with oil and gas blocks are in those countries. With 45% of Yasuni National Park overlapping, even with the citizen referendum, there's still a great deal of danger with respect to what is currently overlapping, inclusive of indigenous territories, almost 20% of indigenous territories in the park under oil and gas blocks. In Madidi National Park in Bolivia, there are approximately 56% of lands overlapping with oil and gas blocks, and nearly 85% of indigenous territories within the national park overlapping. Next slide, please. In Southeast Asia, there's approximately 20% of protected areas in the region overlap with oil and gas blocks for a total of 361 protected areas and nearly 95,000 square kilometers of oil and gas blocks that are overlapping in that region. Next slide, please. One country that stands out is Cambodia, which has just announced a high degree of new protected areas, yet 72% of existing ones overlap with oil and gas blocks. And in in Malaysia, Tun Mustafa Marine Protected Area has 100% oil and gas block overlap and was just auctioned last year. So these are illustrative problems. There's a cascade of more, and we'll hear more about the threats, but we're also going to hear about solutions from leaders who will be joining me next to share more. So next we have Dr. Madhu Rao from the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas.
Thanks, Tyson. And I think I want to answer the question, why do protected areas matter so much? So biodiversity, as we know, is essential for human existence and a good quality of life. And natural ecosystems that harbor high levels of biodiversity, those with high ecological integrity, play an incredibly important role in helping address the twin crises of biodiversity loss and climate change. Protected areas remain one of the most effective tools available to conserve natural ecosystems, so long as they're established and governed effectively and equitably, respecting the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities, and are optimally located to protect biodiversity and other ecosystem services. Nature, as we know it, is in crisis. Direct and indirect drivers of change have accelerated during the past 50 years, and nature and its vital contributions to people are deteriorating worldwide. And in this context, protected areas become even more critical as a defense for nature, helping to secure biodiversity and ecosystem services that are important for human well-being. We have only about 17% of terrestrial areas and less than 8% coverage of coastal and marine areas at the moment that are protected. There is scientific evidence to suggest that if we want to conserve the full spectrum of biodiversity and have the capacity to provide mitigation and adaptation services, we will need at least 30 to about 50% of Earth's surface to be effectively conserved, and for natural resources to be sustainably managed. So degradation of protected areas, even through fossil fuel concessions, is detrimental not just to biodiversity values that the protected areas were established to protect, but have serious implications for indigenous communities through pollution and other negative impacts. So protected areas should essentially be no-go areas for fossil fuel concessions. Protected and conserved areas are the most effective tools to address both biodiversity loss and climate change within a time frame that reflects the required urgency. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rao. Next we'll hear from Kel Kuhn from the Leave It in the Ground initiative.
Thank you very much. So, looking at the situation where many protected areas are not protected from fossil fuels, at LINGO we have asked ourselves the question, where is that the case? And this led to a multi-year effort of identifying the data on coal, oil and gas, extraction and deposits, and protected areas, and mapping the overlap and figuring out where the situation exists. At the end of that, we found over 2,000 cases of the fossil fuel industry encroaching upon protected areas, and the combined fossil fuels underneath sum up to 50 gigatons of CO2. So that is more than the combined annual emissions of humanity that are contained under protected areas in places where there are already industry plants to extract. This is the case in over 900 protected areas worldwide, in 95 countries. And one of the interesting things is that many of these projects are actually relatively small. So these are marginal oil and gas deposits that will not make a big difference to a national picture, but the impacts on biodiversity of operating extraction activities are severe. So we believe that this is an opportunity, or at least a setting where it makes sense to leave these in the ground, because to the overall energy picture, it's not going to make such a big difference. 260 of these projects are supposed to be starting over the next decade, and we believe that there is scope for stopping them before they start. Where are these projects? We have published a global map, an interactive map, which you can find at protected-carbon.org, and zoom in and find out which protected areas are affected in your countries or elsewhere, and also at what stage the operations are. I will give you just 3 examples of such protected areas with fossil fuel operations. The first is from my own country, Germany, and this is the Hambach lignite mine, which is actually located very close to Bonn, to the headquarters of the UNFCCC Secretariat. So right there is a huge coal mine, and if you look at this picture and you think this doesn't look protected, well, you're not alone. The second example is from our host country here. Offshore Abu Dhabi is the biggest marine protected area in the country, and in fact in the Persian/Arabian Gulf, the Marawah Marine Biosphere Reserve is a UNESCO recognized biosphere reserve, and it is threatened by the development of a mega fossil gas project called Kasha, and this is going on as we speak. So there are artificial islands, pipelines to be built, and wells to be drilled inside this protected area offshore the UAE. The third example is also an aspiring COP host, Australia, and there we find the world champion of number of sites, the Kunji Lakes in Australia, in southern Australia, that have 168 fossil fuel sites inside. We have also mapped the companies. If you're interested, you can access that data from the Protected Carbon website and see which companies are involved. In terms of countries, it is not a global south or a global north problem, it is across the board, and you can see a number of countries here that have gigatons of CO2 underneath protected areas in fossil fuel deposits where industry is interested in extracting them. So at LINGO, we have gathered all this data. We're willing to provide it to those who are interested in working on actually protecting protected areas from fossil fuel threats. So we invite you to browse the maps, find out what the situation is, and help us to protect these spaces from the fossil fuel industry. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kel. Blaise, are you ready?
Yeah.
Next, we will have Blaise Mudodosi speaking. He's coordinator from APEM, from the DRC.
Merci beaucoup de la parole. Moi, c'est Blaise Mudodosi, je viens de la République démocratique du Congo. Comme vous le savez, c'est un pays qui regorge la grande partie des forêts du bassin du Congo.
Apologies. If those of you that need translation headsets, they're in the corner, so unless you speak French. Sorry, okay. Please continue.
D'accord. Donc je disais que notre pays, comme vous le savez, il a la grande partie, plus de 60% de forêts du bassin du Congo. Et aujourd'hui, comme vous le savez, il y a aussi un problème de l'exploitation du pétrole, parce que l'année passée, le gouvernement a mis sur le marché mondial 27 blocs pétroliers et 3 blocs gaziers. Et tout cela, quand vous regardez sur la carte, il y a des blocs qui superposent des aires protégées, et pas n'importe quelle aire protégée. Nous avons le parc national de Virunga, qui est le premier parc national en Afrique et qui se trouve déjà aujourd'hui menacé par les blocs pétroliers qui sont sur le marché. À part ça, nous avons aussi le parc national de la Salonga, et qui est aujourd'hui le plus grand parc en termes de superficie en Afrique, qui est aussi superposé par ces blocs. Et là, c'est vraiment des zones forestières où vous avez aussi des tourbières très très importantes. Alors, la crainte, c'est comment on va faire tout ça, si jamais on arrivait à exploiter. Alors, c'est comme ça que depuis un moment, des réflexions ont commencé. Nous, la société civile, nous avons commencé à d'abord dire non au processus, parce que la manière dont il est en train d'être mené, il n'a pas respecté les lois, hein, tout ce qui est dit la loi, et aussi les dangers que cela a par rapport aux communautés. Parce que là-bas, sont des centaines de milliers de communautés qui sont autour de ces sites et qui ne vivent que de l'agriculture, de l'élevage et puis de la pêche. Et voilà, donc considérer qu'on peut exploiter dans des zones comme ça, c'est vraiment amener ces communautés-là à la disparition. Parce que d'ailleurs même quand vous regardez, quand je vois les menaces ou les impacts dans des pays où on a une gouvernance qui est vraiment suffisamment poussée, on se pose la question, en République démocratique du Congo, ça risque d'être pire, et les conséquences pourraient être catastrophiques au regard du rôle que les forêts du bassin du Congo sont appelées à jouer par rapport à l'équilibre climatique. Et maintenant, aujourd'hui, quand nous sommes allés vers les communautés, c'était vraiment la désolation, parce que d'abord, ils ne sont même pas informés du projet, et donc il y a risque que quand les sociétés vont venir, ils vont juste arriver, il n'y a rien, il n'y a pas eu de consultation, il n'y a pas eu... Et ça nous met, nous, vraiment en difficulté, et nous disons non, parce que les communautés se sont même exprimées, et il y a des populations autochtones et communautés locales qui se sont déjà exprimées à travers les différentes notes de position pour dire non à cette exploitation du pétrole et du gaz. Alors, il y a eu des réflexions au niveau de la société civile que nous avons eu à conduire tout récemment, et à l'issue de laquelle on a sorti une déclaration qui est venue non seulement pour dire non, mais qui a proposé aussi des alternatives. Comme le gouvernement disait qu'il avait besoin de l'argent, de moyens, il y a aussi un problème d'énergie. Nous, on l'a proposé l'énergie peut venir d'autres sources. Nous avons un potentiel hydroélectrique très très important qui peut être capitalisé pour avoir de l'énergie pour tout le monde. On a aussi d'autres ressources. Hein. Nous avons des ressources qui peuvent, comme le cobalt, comme le lithium. Hein. On a une réserve très importante qui peut être utilisée vers une économie verte, et même l'agriculture aussi peut être capitalisée, parce qu'on a des vastes superficies arables, et tout ça, c'était ça, ce qui se trouve dans la déclaration que nous avons sortie il y a quelques jours, juste à la veille de notre arrivée ici, et la déclaration pourrait être partagée, et l'idée c'est de nous aider à amplifier les voix de ces populations locales et communautés autochtones pour faire en sorte qu'on mette fin à ces projets qui constituent un danger pour le bassin du Congo et aussi un danger pour le climat mondial. Donc, merci.
Thank you so much, Blaise. And finally, we'll hear from the General Coordinator of COICA, Fanny Cruz Castro.
Bueno, buenas tardes para todos. Soy Fanny Cuiru, coordinadora general de la COICA. La COICA es la organización indígena más grande que hay. Abarca toda la cuenca amazónica, 9 países, 511 pueblos indígenas y sus cosmovisiones. La Amazonía se encuentra en un punto de no retorno, perdiendo la capacidad de sostenerse a sí misma, lo cual implica la pérdida acelerada de la biodiversidad y de los servicios ecosistémicos que la Amazonía presta para preservar la vida y la salud climática. A pesar de esta importancia, la Amazonía, los gobiernos de los países amazónicos continúan otorgando licencias para seguir explorando y explotando combustibles fósiles. Además de que hay otras industrias extractivas en territorios indígenas y áreas protegidas que ponen en riesgo la vida en la Amazonía. Los pueblos indígenas y nuestros territorios somos el ejemplo más eficiente de conservación, al igual que las áreas protegidas constituidas también en territorios indígenas, como son los parques nacionales de Yasuní en Ecuador y Madidi en Bolivia. Estudios científicos han demostrado que las áreas mejor conservadas son los territorios indígenas. Por estas razones, quiero hacer un llamamiento urgente para aumentar la ambición climática por la Amazonía y que se declare de manera urgente la Amazonía como una zona geográfica de exclusión de extracción de combustibles fósiles. Y urgentemente la acción de la protección de al menos el 80% de la Amazonía de aquí al año 2025. Es una iniciativa que hoy la COICA viene liderando, precisamente para evitar que acciones que degradan y dañan la Amazonía estén fuera de este espacio del 80%. De igual manera que los países industrializados dispongan los recursos para cumplir las metas para proteger el 80% de la Amazonía. No podemos continuar con discursos para proteger la Amazonía. Tiene que ser acciones eficientes, urgentes, porque no hay tiempo que perder. Tenemos que proteger todos los biomas estratégicos que ayudan a mitigar los efectos del cambio climático. Gracias.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our speakers. We do have some solutions that are out there and known, so if there are questions from the audience, now could be the time to ask those, and if not, we can share more about some of the solutions that we're pointing to. Okay, so of course we need to immediately ban fossil fuel extraction and expansion in protected areas globally. That is no surprise. And it's the work of many organizations, and it's great to see the tools and resources that LINGO and others are putting together. Obviously, there needs to be solutions for developing nations and other countries to figure out how to, bring in the revenue necessary. So the development and creation of new conservation financing schemes to incentivize and promote the safeguarding of protected areas is essential. Establishing explicit commitments related to fossil fuels and biodiversity, including non-extraction of fossil fuels from protected areas within relevant existing frameworks within the UNFCCC is vital, and also within additional frameworks that are gaining momentum, such as the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance and the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, of which, should be noted, Colombia just recently signed and became members of both, and is setting the way on this topic. looking at where the financing flows come from and restricting financial flows for fossil fuel expansion in general, especially in critical ecosystems, is also vital and must be critical. And lastly, as we look at the energy transition, we need to make sure that it's done in the right ways. I know there's all sorts of gatherings on this topic. There's people in the room who are from Indonesia. Timer Manurang, if you're here, back room, facing nickel extraction and astounding measures with significant impacts to communities and primary forests and natural forests. So we need to make sure that the energy transition happens in the right way. So on that note, thank you to our speakers and thank you all for coming. Appreciate it.